up. We have an interesting keynote speech lined up by a professor of human-computer interaction and the director of Action Lab Australia at Monash University, Australia. He is a renowned human-computer interaction researcher celebrated for his exceptional contributions to the field. With a wealth of expertise in human-centered design methods, digital health, and collaborative and social computing, his work has had a tremendous impact on the intersection of technology and society. One of his most remarkable achievements is coining the term digital civics, which now stands at the heart of his research endeavors. This cross-disciplinary area of study explores innovative ways in which technology can empower and foster new forms of civic participation. Today, we are honored to have this distinguished individual as our keynote speaker, as they take us on a journey into the world of infrastructuring participatory citizenship. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Patrick Olivier to the stage.
Okay, so I've changed my talk a bit, actually, from looking at the schedule, because I see, looking at the talks, you're all sort of, real computer scientists or applied computer scientists, whereas I'm a bit more of a sort of fluffy HCI type person. I'm not actually in origin. My PhD was in computational linguistics and my undergraduate's in physics. But I sort of underwent a bit of a transformation personally in my mid-30s. When I left university, I was an AI and computer graphics person. I left university to do a startup. Amazing experience. 1 minute I'm a sort of an academic plodding along with a few PhD students, thinking I was busy. Then you do a startup, and the startup ultimately failed, but it sort of transformed me as someone who's much more focused on getting things done. Sounds sort of obvious. I mean, it's not if you work in industry, obviously it's blindingly obvious, but to academics who think they're busy, it was quite different. So my whole field shifted, actually. I didn't even start working in HCI until I was about 39, human-computer interaction. So that's about 15, no, how old am I now? 39, yeah, that's about 16 years ago. And when I was in the UK, I work at Monash University in Australia now. When I was in the UK, about 5 years ago, I ran a big initiative at Newcastle upon Tyne, Newcastle University in the UK, in this topic called digital civics. So at the time in the UK, there's a lot of funding for cross-disciplinary research. The Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council actually used to fund more social science research than the Social Science Research Council. Such was their commitment. That's actually changed a lot recently, but it was an interesting time to do very sort of socially engaged research. So we had a big doctoral centre and a hub working on this area of digital technologies and what we call participatory citizenship. So thinking about, how can we use digital technologies in ways that will sort of increase people's ability to participate in society, to shape the way services are actually delivered, and actually to participate in the commissioning of services. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today and give you a sort of, a high-level introduction to the sort of thinking. So it's not going to be a deeply technical talk in any sense of the word. So you probably know when we think of human-computer interaction, we can think of these general areas, the sort of interaction technologies, boys and their toys, talking to some students today, I don't know how many final year undergraduates do projects on accessibility, not because they're particularly interested in accessibility, but because it's a sort of an obvious way you might do something that is sort of low-hanging fruit in terms of technology and evaluation. So interaction techniques, things like Internet of Things, collaborative systems, design methods. These are sort of the general scope of when we think of human-computer interaction, that phase between the user and the system. And how do we design them? What sort of technologies? And it's quite interesting because in human-computer interaction and in computing in general, we have this sort of term, user, and we used to sort of joke that, when you mean user, we actually sort of mean consumer, okay? And you might think like, well, yeah, fair enough. So if you're thinking consumer, so you're thinking user as consumer, that actually frames how you design your services, yep? How you conceptualize services. Not in a bad way necessarily, but it certainly does rule out a certain set of designs. And citizens, when we think of citizens, are not consumers in that sense, in terms of a citizen, in terms of their relationship to the state, to local government, to each other, are not consumers. And the sort of interesting thing is like, well, so what? What difference does that make to how we think about technologies? And the way I'd think about it is I think about this idea of framing the use of technologies as in the production of what we call transactional services to relational services. So when we think of a transactional service, and we certainly think of a consumer as on one end of a transaction, we might think of something like a bus service, okay? Plenty of these in Colombo. You know, you look at the timetable, you go to the bus stop, there's a time, you know, if the transaction is working well, you actually can get from A to B to C, you give your money to the bus driver, etc. Yeah? So there's a transaction there, and there's a service you're getting. If you think of something like ride sharing, and let's not think about all the awfulness of Uber's employment practices or things like this, but if you think about ride sharing, that's not just framing it as a transaction. That frames mobility as people with mobility resources, drivers with cars and the time to spare or the time to drive, and people with mobility needs, people who want to get to A to B. So the relational service there is about matching them up, brokering a trusted interaction between them, giving someone a ride, the exchange of funding. Of course, people like Uber don't do that service properly because they stop in the design of that relational, they stop in the design of that relational service because they're not thinking about, oh, well, what about the other things that we want from these drivers, the other things they want to drive, because they want to treat the drivers as individuals. So, but still, there's a difference between a transactional service and a relational service. And it matters because when we think of digital government, and I'm sure we get this a lot in Australia, a lot in UK, I'm sure they talk about it in Sri Lanka, that narrow framing of government digital services as transactions just means you think about how can we use digital to extend access and lower the cost of a transaction. They're not thinking about how can we use digital to leverage people's social capacity, leverage their social capacity. What am I on about? I've lost the word. Leverage their social capital. Sorry. Think about how we personalize or tailor services to particular needs of locations. It's really just about lowering the cost of those transactions. So I want to talk about, if we're thinking about citizens, what does it mean to think relational? And I don't just mean everything isn't just a sharing economy. Now, really simple example. When we work in this area, we tend to move, away from the sort of narrowly technical, and we're really thinking about systems which are collaborative systems because they're about connecting people in some service, and thinking about the design methods that we use when we're developing these services. So one of the very first ones we did, it's trivial system. This is like an undergraduate project when you looked at it. We were working with mothers in the north of England. And there's an issue in Europe around breastfeeding mothers. They don't breastfeed enough, basically, and there's plenty of evidence for why breastfeeding your child for longer is good for the mother, it's good for the child, etc., etc. I'm sure women are sick of being lectured about why they should be breastfeeding, but still, it's a public health concern. And when we workshop these mothers in Newcastle, we talk to them about, why don't you breastfeed for longer? And what they talk about is they talked about this notion that they're just going to be stuck at home because they don't know where, when they're out, they don't know where there is a good place to breastfeed, whether it's clean, somewhere they feel secure doing it. So very simple, classic problem for, a location-based review system. So we built ever so simple. It's basically just a system where there's 4 criteria which we designed with the mothers that they rate a location for: price, cleanliness, security, friendliness, I think it was in these ones. And this was advocated by midwives and breastfeeding advocates, and women would literally rate locations. So go out, do it around the north of England. And, it's successful. This was like a third of someone's PhD, so he was very pleased because he had like, 70,000 venues rated by people in the UK. And it's mundane, in a way, as a piece of technology because you think it's a location-based review system. But in public health terms, it's actually a sort of, it's actually a very challenging concept for local government in the UK because the local government in the UK think their job is to rate locations and be a trusted broker of information. They don't think of themselves as people who should frame the mothers as experts and actually give them an infrastructure for sharing their understanding of places. Of course, we all know review systems are sort of how we navigate the internet or something, but they're not considered an information source by government to be designed for. Okay, so that's very simple. But then you think the next step, you think, well, okay, if we're really thinking about being more participatory, well, we've sat down here, haven't we? We've said, oh, we'll design this system for mothers around, but to try and address this issue of like getting women to breastfeed more. And there were some very interesting uses of this data. We've got plenty of examples where they're going into shops and advocating that big supermarkets create breastfeeding spaces because other shops have. So it's more than just finding a location. It's actually having evidence to try and drive change in your local community. But actually, we're deciding that it's going to be a breastfeeding location review app. So you can take a step up from that and say, well, there's actually no reason to do that, is there? We could give people the opportunity to propose their own location review app. Okay, so they go to this site, App Movement. They can literally go there and make a little case. We need an app for, what have I got here? We need an app for, I'm trying to go back. Where can I find free condoms? This is a sexual health charity in the UK. Or it's another breastfeeding one, but it's a Lebanese breastfeeding advocacy group, and they want different criteria to the app movement. Or where to get my Volkswagen, where to get my Volkswagen serviced in Tartarstan, or where to fly my drone. Now, it's not like Kickstarter where you're asking anyone for money. You're basically asking people to support you by logging into the site. So logging into the site, so there's you make your little case for why I want a website for where a good place to fly your drone is. They web onto the site because there's got to be a bit of friction. You can't just have people liking anything, and they support it. I think it was only 50 supporters when this drone zone one came through. It was right early on in Andy Garbutt's PhD. They support it, and if you hit above the threshold, it goes then into a design phase. And in the design phase, it's not really design, it's configuration. So people can propose a name for the app. They can propose the icon, the color scheme. More importantly, they can compose the rating options. These 4 things that in that breastfeeding feed finder app, they can propose the rating options. And you see here, someone said scenic value, ease of access, low wind, and vote for the 4 that they think is best. And at the end of the week, the app's automatically generated, of course, because it's just that same feed finder app with different icons, color scheme, and a few rating feeds. Automatically generated, popped in Google Play and the App Store, and then what happens? Well, then what happens depends, doesn't it? It's up to the supporters and the person who's proposed that app to start populating it. If they don't, it doesn't matter, because this is essentially, marginal cost of producing this is 0. So the implications of that is actually we've had a number of them come through. You can have very small location-based review systems commissioned in this case by, you can't quite see the number here, it's a Facebook group in Newcastle upon Tyne. And that app's only got 754 reviews and 3,000 downloads. You wouldn't pay anyone to build something like that. It's just too small. And it wouldn't be worth your while paying someone to maintain it. But of course, it is a single code base app movement in that sense. Or it could be something like drone zones, where you've got, this was a couple of years ago, 20,000 locations, 57,000 downloads, And of course, there's ones there that have barely been used at all, because they were, the support for them, I think, in a sense, was artificially generated. Now, again, you know, this is not rocket science, but where that Feed Finder app you can think of as an infrastructure for women to review locations, yeah? So it's a location-based review service provided by government or some supplier. You can think of app movement is actually a service that lets people commission their own service. And that's a sort of much bigger idea that and of course it's very limited, it's not any app, but we know these days with sort of no-code development, you know, the options there could be significantly more. So, when we do digital civics, we do lots of this sort of thing. Collaborative applications, all open source, very much co-designed with end users. And this sort of area of sort of social impact computing is sort of highly populated by platforms, participatory platforms, as we might call them. Yeah? But platforms have a problem, and this is sort of something we ran into. Platform thinking in particular has a problem. Oh dear, I'm sorry. Platform in particularly has a problem for researchers, which is, you know, the obvious ones. New platforms come with barriers. You know, people are not familiar with them. They don't necessarily trust them, and if you knew anything about university research data governance, you definitely wouldn't be trusting them. They're not often, they need to be secure, they need to be usable, they need to be accessible, you might need moderation if there's content produced in them, they need to be dependable and scalable. You know, this is what computing businesses do, and research groups in universities generally aren't particularly good at doing, or are not resourced to keep these platforms going. So they're difficult to design and to execute, and they're very costly to maintain. So it's quite hard when you're thinking, well, my researchers, I want to do this research in digital technologies and participatory citizenship, but the only way I can do it at the sort of scale I want to do is if I build a platform, and building that platform, well, if it was that easy, everyone would be Mark Zuckerberg, wouldn't they? So instead, we sort of took a different view. We thought, okay, it's the wrong word actually, but it's the one we came up with. We thought, let's not build a platform and ask people to come there. Let's unplatform, a bit like when we talk about unconferencing. Let's actually go where the action is happening already. Go to those sites where people are doing things, to the WhatsApps, to the WeChats, to the TikToks, to the Nextdoor, and actually say, well, what actually, if we go there, what can we do there? So I'll run you through a little bit of an example. This was again a piece of work we did a couple of years ago. Actually, 4 years ago now, with IFRC. So this is the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Society. So this is like our example of unplatforming. So what happened is the innovation arm of the, so international, everyone knows what the Red Cross, Red Crescent is. There's 109, you know, if you're a signatory to the Geneva Convention, you have to have a Red Cross or Red Crescent. So there's a Red Cross in Sri Lanka, I'm pretty sure. And the International Federation coordinates them. It's federated, so they're not in charge of them, they try and coordinate them. And this is part of the International IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, called the Solferino Academy. It's their global innovation arm. So they came to us, we do a lot of work with them actually, and they said, we've got to come up with a strategy for the Red Cross movement for 2030. Anyone who's worked in a university knows that this is the sort of regular thing. We need our 10-year strategy. And of course, what they wanted is they want youth involved, because in a humanitarian organisation, young people are, you know, politically very important to the organisation. They're always prioritised. So, you know, we'll just think about it. Oh, we want young people and we want to talk about strategy. Well, you know, those two things do not really go together. So what we did is we reframed it. We didn't, you know, they were thinking, oh, we'll build a wiki and we'll get young people to put their thoughts. And we thought, no, let's do what we're talking about and go where the action is. So we literally got young people to sign up with their WhatsApp phone numbers. So this was the first scale pilot. So they sign up with their WhatsApp numbers. And what we do is we'd put them into a WhatsApp group. And we give them a role. We'd say, all right, you're the environmental scientist, you're the technologist, you're the economic advisor, you're the cultural advisor. And then instead of talking about strategy for how the Red Cross what the Red Cross should do for 2030, we got them to future forecast. So we said, okay, by day 5 in this group, we want you to think about what a humanitarian challenge in 2030. So they'd be in these groups, actually, these little, that little group of 4, it's actually 4 to 6 people, would be one of these orange dots. And if you're the environmental scientist in that group, you'd also be put in another WhatsApp group. And this other WhatsApp group is with 50 other environmental scientists from other groups. And you'd have activities in these other groups, little conferences, discussions about environmental issues in the environmental scientist, or tech issues in the other one. And by day 5, they had the challenge was to actually produce a newspaper front story of a humanitarian challenge in 2030. And each of these groups actually had a coordinator. And that coordinator is just another Red Cross volunteer who's actually in 20 WhatsApp groups. Actually creates the groups and put people in them because we don't have any automation. So we're pulling out their stories and making a leaderboard. And then by day 10, they have to actually come up with a film, a sort of imaginary report back to the Secretary General of the Red Cross about what had happened. So what you've got there, you know, we did it with 4,000 young people, Spanish and English, over 4 time zones, with about, I think it was about 15 volunteers supporting it from Geneva. And very interesting in a sense, because of course we got 250,000 interactions in WhatsApp that the leads, facilitate future guys actually uploaded. You've got all the media content they produced. But, you know, forgetting aside that, and actually it was half the participants that actually contributed to the strategy for the IFRC for 2030. But forgetting all that, the sort of interesting issue is like, well, what are we doing here? You know, I talk about unplatformed systems. You know, the question is, well, you know, what have we done? Well, you know, we've just stuck some things together, haven't we? You know, we've just got some nice ideas, and, you know, it's nice to have someone in a little group and give them a role, and, put them in a big group with other people there. So, you know, the step as a sort of researcher there is thinking about, well, what are you doing here? Yeah? Is this just some arbitrary thing that you've knocked up? And it's sort of that moving to that step of thinking, well, how do we think about this sort of a little bit more systematically? So generally, when we're doing innovation, we're thinking in terms of design. And of course, the double diamond from the UK Design Council is the sort of traditional model of, you know, innovation or design thinking. So you'll be familiar with it, I'm sure, where basically we think of it as diamonds because first we have a general problem. We don't really know what the problem is, which is the first problem. And we have this sort of diamond that diverges as we research the problem. You know, we do some primary research, we observe things, we do some secondary research, we look at the literature. We do, you know, more peripheral research for inspiration. And then we have a phase of synthesis where we're converging as we're making sense of that domain. And it's only really in the middle of here we have our design brief, the thing we know that is actually the thing we're designing for. And then we have this ideation phase. And finally, development, where we do our iterative development. And that ideation phase is often, you know, it's not just, it's obviously a lot of the time depicted as brainstorming and creative ideas that pop out of somewhere. But what we need often are frameworks for thinking about how we work with the constraints we've got, technological constraints, to design systems or socio-technical systems. And we can think about this, you know, by analogy to what you might think of craft practices. So when we think of something like woodwork, yeah, and we think about the material qualities of the wood that we're working with. So we think in terms of stiffness, we think in terms of flexibility, of softness. And then we think about the operations that we can apply to that wood. The operations to shape it, the operations to fix it together. So when we're thinking about social media and designing with social media, this sort of unplatformed design model is a way of sort of thinking about, well, what are the material qualities of social media? So when you think of WhatsApp, let's take that WhatsApp example. Well, what are the material qualities of WhatsApp that we're manipulating when we come up with this simple coordinated action? Well, actually, oh, sorry. I really shouldn't keep walking away from this thing, should I? So what they are is, well, remember I said that we put young people that join into a WhatsApp group and we give them a role, yeah? And you think, well, actually in a WhatsApp group we have this concept of role, don't we? We have this concept of an admin or not an admin, or in Facebook it might be different, or workplace you might have moderators. So role is something that we can manipulate. Obviously there's morphology. You know, these are essentially sets and they can be overlapping, you know, through membership of multiple different groups. We also, when we think of social media, we can think of permeability, which is actually to do with, you know, we think of it as like the ease of actually extracting information out of one of these systems, and also representation of activity. So the difference between Facebook is you can make groups public, and you know, you can have different controls over the representation of a group, the visibility of activity in that group, whereas in Facebook you can't. You're either in it and you can see it, or you just can't see it. So these are sort of things we can set up. And then when we think about the operations, well, what are the operations we can do? Well, the simplest operation in social media is we can think about configuration. Yeah? I can make you the admin of a group, or I can not make you the admin of a group. That's just configuring. Yeah? I can make you a member of 2 WhatsApp groups, or I can not make you a member of 2 groups. So that's just configuring the things, configuring the media as we think about it. We can do things like hard augmentation. I can build a website, and I can pull out content from WhatsApp and stick it on that website. Well, that's a hard augmentation we think about. You know, we're making a new thing and integrating it with that social media. But we can also have soft augmentations. And soft augmentations are these sort of norms that we ask people to comply with. So we ask people to be the environmental scientist, be the technologist, play that role in the group. And of course, you know, people have a literacy about behavior in social media, and setting up those expectations means they'll do things in those groups that the system's not affording. It's just the norms of the activity. So we can think of social media like that, and I won't drag you on too much, but actually, you know, there are a number of features like why is it useful to think this way? And obviously, we get great reach if we're actually repurposing media or reusing social media. We actually are leveraging a literacy that people have with that technology as well as all the other features that it exists. But what we need sort of systematic ways of thinking about how we design and reconfigure it. And a lot of this goes on already, of course, in things like Facebook. And we can pull it apart. I've got a slide here. You can probably, I can point you at the paper actually on the website, where we think about, you know, these material qualities like morphology and the operations. So when we think about designing that what futures game, well, more interaction of morphology and configuration is basically just saying, well, how many people are going to be in these groups? Oh, it's going to be 4 to 6. How many are going to be in the conferences? It's going to be 50. That's a design decision, yeah? When we think of things like soft augmentation, let's take role, well, hard augmentation, where we're thinking about administrative rights on external technology, but in our configuration, we know we can set those rights. A soft augmentation is where you might give people duties to do in that group. You're not enforcing it. It's a norm you're establishing in that group and requiring to participate in. Now, these are all degrees of freedom that you can use in designing. So, oh yeah, I should say lastly, actually, where's that last one? Hang on. Can I go backwards? Yeah, so the last one I wanted to show was actually, I've lost it, doesn't matter. The last one is actually a really nice fold-up paper that we made out of the stories for these future newspaper stories for a sort of newspaper of the future that folded in on itself and was distributed at the General Assembly of the Red Cross. Now, I guess my point is, what I wanted to do is come back to that idea of the digital civics. So that concept of contrasting relational and transactional models, and hopefully get you to sort of think about when we're thinking in this sort of participatory citizenship mode, we're not just thinking about taking a physical transaction we have in the world and making it a digital one. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not realizing that capability, whereas if we're thinking about how we might connect people in knowledge sharing, in knowledge production, we can build a sort of more relational models of, you know, digital services that respond to the character, the capabilities and capacities of a locale. Anyway, thanks for listening. I'll clap myself. Any questions? I've got a slide with suggested questions if you want. No, I'm only joking. Any questions?
Thank you very much. Your ideas about the human-centered computing and sharing the location. What I have seen in the framework context, we have to share the other personal information. If you just take it, for example, Google.
Yeah.
I'll share my location when I use the Google Maps. And end of the month, I get in a chart saying where I traveled the whole month, even without asking me.
Yeah.
So this is a kind of a privacy violation and misuse of information. But they always say, I gave my consent. Because without giving my consent, I can't use the service.
Yeah.
And the other kind of an argument could be to protect the privacy, you can divide the framework. Well, the server side, you can have all the facilities, the client side, where things could be generated.
Yeah.
So my privacy information will not go it.
Yeah.
But then obviously, the type of services that could be provided to me may be definitely limited.
Yeah.
So what is your
Comments
thoughts?
on that then?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's interesting, of course, because, you know, the classic, you know, the obvious argument against unplatforming is you're trying to leverage a service that already sort of abuses your privacy and sells your data and your information, so why? And I think there's, you know, I think we're in a sort of, if we go forward in time and look back to where we are now, it will feel like the Wild West. You know, people won't believe exactly what we did and how people were perfectly happy to share their data. I think what they'll also do is think about, there's very little regulation over these technologies. Yep, so very little regulation over gig technologies, over peer-to-peer loans, over Airbnb. And that's something we've learned is Airbnb can actually destroy communities. Yeah, Airbnb is also, you know, potentially a valuable resource that can be leveraged by government in the periods of bushfires and disasters and all sorts of things. It's an infrastructure. But there's a sense that because it has developed as it has, it's treated as a sort of private resource, yeah? And it's like, oh, but they designed that and they did that. But, you know, but these things are obvious, aren't they? And so really they're infrastructures, which I think, you know, we will, in the end, think of creative ways to regulate sounds the wrong word, but be able to actually appropriate them and ask people to behave in certain ways on them. I think it's an interesting question, the one where you talk about the privacy, you know, because like, I don't really want to go there because it's like we know the discussions and we know the things, they abuse people's privacy and yet, people seem to behave like they don't care about their privacy. But that's not an argument for not worrying about people's privacy, as we all know. We all sign the terms and conditions on apps because if we don't, we're not going to be able to use it. You know, it's not because we actually don't care. We've just fallen into that sort of trap of it's okay for a provider to provide you with a totally illegible and unmanageable terms and conditions. There is no real consent there in actual fact, even though they know it. And in fact, it's in their interest to generate you consent documents that are totally inaccessible so you don't even bother trying to engage with them. And they're not required to provide contingent consents, level of consents to use, occasionally in location data. But I think it is, you know, maybe just talk about another thing. It's quite interesting. We work in You know, I'm probably like the least woke person in the world. Maybe not in this room, but certainly when I'm in Australia are. But we work with Indigenous Australians, and you know, and Indigenous Australians, they've been talking about this thing for years now, data sovereignty. So this idea that actually, not necessarily technical data, but heritage materials, knowledge, there's a sense of sovereignty. They feel a sense of ownership of it, and the need to control and curate it, and not just have it taken off them. And it's quite interesting in our data governance systems, when you look at universities, as I was talking about earlier, we have this sort of horrible habit, just the same, of sucking data up from our subjects, not giving people access to it, not giving them control over their data. So I think actually one of the biggest technology drives that will happen in civics is people having more insight into how their data is being used, not just in companies, in government. Estonia have this incredible system where you can see what data government has on you and which other government departments are looking at that data. You know, and it's this sort of thing you can do now. This whole idea about signing data sharing agreements if you're a university, you shouldn't have to do that. You don't need to give people your data. They need to give you their analysis routines and you can give them the results. And that thinking will move on. But I think you're right, the challenges are there. It's sort of weird that it's almost like you want the consumer drivers to be there, don't you, for people to have good privacy mechanisms, yet people almost just give it up. You know, it's a bit like the free speech argument. You know, it's like, oh, well, it's not going to affect me, so does it really matter? And it's a sort of civic literacy thing in actual fact. You know, you think like, we think of ourselves too much as an individual, and we don't realise the consequences of that. That's not a great answer to your question, I know, but it's quite a hard one, actually. Anyone else?
Yeah, actually I have too many questions, but to minimize the risk of appearing too crazy, let me pick one. There's a different way of looking at this unplatforming thing that I'm thinking about is probably you are aware of ActivityPub, which is like IETF, like Internet Engineering Task Force defined this protocol, application layer protocol. So
no, I'm not familiar with it. Go on.
All right. Okay. So there's an entire community of decentralized social media platforms like Mastodon, Blue Sky.
That are looking for interoperability.
So there are individual instances, and they all like different kinds of software, but they all talk to each other through a common.
Great.
Yeah. So can we use that kind of thing?
Well, you'd hope so, wouldn't you? Because I think that goes to the sort of permeability, that property we say. Because the thing about WhatsApp is it's totally not permeable. And the thing about Facebook, it was all a bit too permeable when they were actually had the Friends API and they were learning all the stuff, not just about the user, but about all their friends. But I think that's your point. That's where the infrastructures are, you know, it's good in regulatory terms for the market because it lets people move their you can see your social media assets and history as something that is transportable. Remember, they used to say this about banks, but now in the UK, you can literally just swap a bank like that, you know. And people don't necessarily, but you can do it. So yeah, I think that's very interesting. Other areas, maybe coming back to the point we had earlier also, is around governance models in social media. Yeah. So it's a bit, at the moment, it's a little bit like, you know, permissions on a folder. We've all got used to, there's only one way of doing it. But actually some really nice work at Carnegie Mellon where they're talking about, it's called Policy Toolkit. And it's actually some work I've thought about before. It's one of those things where you think, shit, I should have done this because they've gone and done it really nicely. There's a lovely whist paper about it. And they basically come up with a system where you can implement different policy systems for a Reddit group. So you can actually have democratically elected moderators rather than just moderators. And I've always thought about, if you've ever started a company, you know, a small company with a few people, there's always this sort of thing like, who has the domain name? You know, there's only one, you know, unless you form the company and the company owns it, often one person has it. And I think there's a lot of space actually for governance design, actually, that will allow people to implement different practices in those. But no, you're right. It's a really obvious point, and I should have made that. And how will that work? Okay. I'm going to call this session to an end. So thanks for listening. I'll be around for a bit. So just grab me if you want to chat.